welcome to the first in this year's series of online research seminars hosted by the British Centre for Literary Translation at the University of East Anglia in Norwich, England. My name is Duncan Large and I'm the BCLT's Executive Director. This is the fourth year in which we've been hosting these seminars online, and recordings of all our previous seminars, together with other online BCLT events, are available on the BCLT YouTube channel for you to catch up. You'll be aware that this event is also being recorded, and we'll be adding the recording to the YouTube channel shortly. As ever, I'm grateful to my BCLT colleagues Anna Good and Lily Alden for their technical assistance. One of the great advantages of using the online platform for these seminars is not only that we can welcome audience members from all over the globe, and welcome to you, but that we're delighted to be able to invite speakers from far afield too. And today is one of those occasions that could only have been made possible by the online medium. It gives me great pleasure then to introduce Kobus Marais as today's speaker. Kobus is Professor of Translation Studies in the Department of Linguistics and Language Practice at the University of the Free State in Bloemfontein, South Africa, where he's been teaching since 2006. His publications in translation studies include 3 monographs with Routledge: Translation Theory and Development Studies from 2013, a Biosemiotic Theory of Translation 2018, and most recently, Trajectories of Translation, the Thermodynamics of Semiosis 2023, which provides the immediate backdrop to today's talk. Kobus has also co-edited Translation Studies Beyond the Post-Colony with Ilse Feinauer and 3 Routledge collections with Rainer Meilertz. In 2016, he was a founding member of the Association for Translation Studies in Africa, and he's currently the association's vice president. He's also the founding editor of the Journal for Translation Studies in Africa. Most recently, Kobus co-edited a special issue of the journal Translation Studies on the conceptualization of translation in translation studies, past, present, and future. And he also has a chapter on humanizing translation, forthcoming in the Routledge Handbook of the History of Translation Studies, due out in March next year. Before I hand over to Kobus, let me just say that after his talk, we'll have time for questions. So we're using the Zoom webinar platform, and that allows you to submit questions via the Q&A button, as well as to upvote others' questions that you would particularly like to see answered. So that function will be available all the way through. Do feel free to submit your questions at any time, and I'll put them to Kobus on your behalf at the end. For now, though, it's my great pleasure to hand over to Kobus for a talk which is entitled Explorations into the Thermodynamics of Semiosis. Welcome, Kobus.
Thank you very much, Duncan. While you were talking, I was wondering, sort of in a very colloquial sense, who of you or I are the whack jobs around here for talking to literary translation people about thermodynamics? So, yeah, probably both of us. But thank you very much for this invitation. It's really an honor for me to speak in this context of your Center for Literary Translation, and to engage with scholars from all over the world and share some ideas, whether they're worthwhile or not. So thank you very much. I am quickly just going to try to share my screen. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for sitting in for this. I thought, as an introduction, just to share some ideas about why do I go to the trouble, and Duncan can maybe later on add into this, why do we go to the trouble in being interested in a topic like this in a humanities context. It might be craziness. That's always a possibility. But for now, there might also be some good reasons for that. So let us see. So I think when we work in the humanities, we are interested in what it means. Sorry, I'm just starting my clock. What it means to be human. And I think we all know that it's not a simple question, but the point that I will try to make is that humanities scholars alone cannot answer this question. We need debate with other scholars, because humans are not only idea things, they are also living things, and they are also matter, energy, or physical things. And to understand what it means to be human, I think we need to engage beyond ideas and beyond what the humanities typically does. So I initially sort of had the idea that I'm against or pitching against something like symbolicism, but let's call it in a more positive vein, engaging. So what I want to do in my work is to engage the idea that humans operate at an ideational level only. This is what Timo Maran, the Estonian semiotician, calls symbolicism. And I would like to engage that argument and see what happens if we also consider ourselves living materially and in energy. What are the implications? I think I also want to engage a kind of solipsism that I think is involved in stronger forms of constructivism and idealism, where other humans, other life and other non-life are merely projections of my construction. I think that that is not a helpful situation for us if the constructing agent has too much power, if I can put it that way. So I'm trying to engage this kind of constructivism and the solipsism that goes with it to see what kind of humans are we if we are not solely constructing, but also being constructed, and responding to real others, whether they be human or not, or alive or not. I think I'm also trying to engage disciplinarity. As I said in the beginning, I don't think that we can solve, well, not solve the problem, where we can understand the problem of being human without understanding human as being life. What are the features of life, of organism, but also in terms of we are matter and energy. What does it mean that we are matter and energy? What are the implications of that for being human? So I'm trying to find a way of thinking that will engage multiple disciplines. And I don't think it's a matter of physics envy, for instance, trying to move the debate to the level of physics. I think it's an engagement with the others, be they physicists, biologists, or whatever. So I think it's an effort at engagement. But I think we also need to engage the ecological crisis, which partially has been formed by the fact that we think we are in control of the world, and we can do with the world what we want, and we don't take the world as an other serious. And I think that this ecological crisis and some of its roots are linked to some of our ideas about human agency, and I think even sometimes some of the ethical crises we have now, the Palestine-Israel situation, which is foremost on our minds in these days, the Russian-Ukrainian war, the kind of ethical and ecological situations in which we are somehow, sometimes I think, caused by the fact that the other is just an idea for us, and we can kind of make with that idea what we want. So I'm trying to think sort of a a theoretical framework in which matter and energy and mind and ideas can be explained in the same framework. Whether that is successful is obviously a question. I don't claim to be successful. That's why I call it explorations. And let's see what comes of it. I just have two caveats before I go on. The first one is, as I said just now, that this is just an exploration. I don't think anybody really understands how these things work. We are grasping here in the dark and trying to explain what it means to be human. How come that we are matter that can think and feel and have intentions? So this is an exploration. The other point I just also need to clarify is that I'm aware that there are different cosmologies, right? So if you come to this question with a religious cosmology or a vitalist cosmology or some other kind of cosmology, you will do this completely. You will do this completely different. The reason why I'm choosing the kind of, let's say, Western scientific cosmology is because I think other cosmologies assume the kind of things that we want to explain in this Western cosmology. By that, I don't say that the Western cosmology is in the end the right one. I'm not claiming that. But if I work within this kind of scientific cosmology, then I cannot say that how come humans can think? Well, God made them to think, or everything can think. That's not an explanation. That's so what we are looking here for is explanation. So I just want to acknowledge the relativeness of my own position here, and that I recognize there are other cosmologies. I'm even thinking of ways to maybe combine this kind of Western cosmology with some of the more spiritual cosmologies. I'm not sure, but I won't talk about that today. So where do I start? I start basically with the 2018 book, 2019, I can't remember, that Duncan referenced, the biosemiotic theory of translation. And that book is basically just taking this very simple idea by Charles Peirce, where he asks, what is the meaning of a sign? And then he answers it by saying, the meaning of a sign is its translation into another sign. And I take this basic idea and I try to work out a number of implications through this. And from there, I reconceptualized, if you want, or expanded a bit Peirce's idea, where I take the notion of work that seems for me to be embedded in Peirce's conceptualization. The meaning of a sign is its translation into another sign. Something has to happen with a sign. And I take that as work that has to be done to translate the sign into another sign. So for me, translation then is negentropic semiotic work, and you don't now have to worry too much about the negentropic that is performed to constrain dynamic semiotic systems. And dynamic semiotic systems, I mean semiotic systems that are based in matter and energy, and I will show you how that works in a moment, for teleodynamic reasons. In other words, goal-intended, pragmatic, functional reasons. So I don't think you should worry yourselves too much about this now. You can always read up on this. It's just, this is where I'm coming from. So if I want to construct a theoretical framework in which matter, energy, mind are combined, I think that requires at least two moves, two arguments. The first argument is I need to prove that that physical things can have non-physical consequences, right? So for instance, the atoms in the ink on a printed page can cause an emotion with me, or can cause a thought with me, or a letter saying, I'm coming home this weekend, can cause expectations with me. So you have physical things that have non-physical consequences. And how how does that happen? So that's sort of the first big argument that one has to make. The second argument is the reverse. How can non-physical things have physical consequences? So let's just take the idea of social justice, which is a non-physical thing. It's an idea, but it can end somebody up in jail, or it could end somebody up in a better position than they were. So a non-physical thing can also have physical consequences. And the question is not that it happens, but what we need to explain is how this happens. How is this possible? Again, I'm not claiming to give a full answer. I'm exploring sort of where should we look for answers. And the kind of answer that I'm suggesting at this point is a synthesis between energy and information and significance. And this is what I will try and do for you now. So energy, let me also say I'm going to go quite briefly over really lengthy and in-depth arguments to give you a kind of a overview of the argument, and then I will try at the end to have a few minutes to talk about some data that I analyzed with this line of thinking. So this is not really a theory of translation. It's more like a philosophical conditions under which translation operate, or where translation work. So yeah, if you just keep that in mind. So what is energy? Energy is not something. The physicists tell us that energy is the difference between two physical states, right? If one state is, for instance, warmer than another state, then there's energy that you can leverage. Or if one thing is moving and another one is standing still, then there's energy that you can leverage. So energy is a difference, not a thing. So imagine a bathtub. It has 50 liters of water in it, but it's plugged. Typically, water can do work. I mean, you all know that water can drive electric turbines and mills and all these kinds of things. But this water in the bath is in equilibrium. It's fully entropic. There's no difference with anything. It is just lying there. It's doing nothing. If you pull the plug, you create a difference between the pressure on the water and the pressure in the outlet pipe, and then the water starts flowing. Now you have energy. And if you were smart, you could put a little turbine in your outlet pipe of your bath, and that could charge your cell phone for a moment after you've taken a bath, right? So the important point is just energy isn't something. Energy is the difference between two physical states, right? Information is like energy, not something. So information is not a substance. The black ink on a white page isn't information. It is the difference between the black ink and the white page that allows for information to be constructed. So like energy, information is a relationship between two physical states or systems. And Gregory Bateson famously said that information is a difference, a physical difference that you need to be able to observe that makes a difference. In other words, information is the effect that energy or physical differences have for living organisms. And Terence Deacon distinguishes three aspects of information, namely its syntax, its semantics, and its pragmatics. So all information has this syntactic dimension to them or aspect to them. He calls it Shannon information. So Claude Shannon was the famous engineer who proposed the engineering theory of information. But Deacon's argument is that Shannon only spoke about the syntax of information, the carrying capacity of a medium through which you send information, and the entropy, the way that this message can go askew. in the process, right? But it is important. Syntax is an important part of information, but it's not the only thing that we need to know about information. We also need the semantics, which Deacon calls Boltzmann information. This is reference to Ludwig Boltzmann, who was a thermodynamics specialist in the 1800s. And he proved that one physical system can be about another physical system. So if you walk into a bathroom, the water is in the bath, there's nothing flowing, the water inside the bath and the water outside the bath is the same temperature. There's no information, there's no reference. It is just what it is. But the moment you walk into the bathroom and the water is warm and the air around the water is cool, there's a difference between these systems and they reference one another, right? The difference between these systems says that one has been heated and one hasn't. And that is basically just reference. The one is about the other one. And then the third, let's say, aspect of information is the pragmatics, which we all know from linguistics, which Deacon calls Darwinian information, which means that for living organisms, what goes on inside the organism and what goes on outside the organism needs to be coupled for survival. It can be coupled in the genetic information, but it can also be coupled in what the organism learns in its life, right? So Boltzmann information, the reference, doesn't mean anything yet. It has to be interpreted from the perspective of the interests of the living organism. So in terms of the typical Persian triad, where we have, Peirce says a sign is basically, you have a sign vehicle, which he calls the representament, which stands for an object, which can be an idea or something, and which is interpreted by someone, which he calls the interpretant, right? So this is his basic meaning, theory of meaning. And what we have here is a kind of a synthesis between matter and energy and semiosis. If we can, and I think I have demonstrated that the representament is the carrying capacity of the medium. In other words, the very materiality of this medium. The object is the reference based on the way in which this medium has been constrained, and the interpretant is the process of determining the relevance of the object through the representament. So to explain this a bit better, I think this gives us a kind of a theory or a conceptualization, not a theory, a conceptualization of matter, energy, meaning emerging in one world, or gives a unified explanation of how this works. So information is always carried in matter and in energy. But the information is not in that physicality itself. The information is in the constraints, in other words, in the syntax. So you have to constrain the ink on a whiteboard to create the possibility of certain meanings being inferred from that. So it's not the ink that in itself carries the meaning. The atoms don't carry any meaning, but the constraints on that matter and energy allows for information. And the information is therefore the relation between two physical states, the board and the ink, for instance. But not just when we talk about living organisms, the information is not just automatically there. It has to be interpreted for the organism. So these energy and matter states outside of an organism, question is, for the organism, what do they mean? What are their relevance for me? So interpretation is always a process of selecting the physical features that are relevant, that I need to take note of, and then inferring what the implications are for me. So it's, again, the link between matter energy that I observe in my world outside of me, linked to the ideas that I form about them as an organism. So the second move that I want to make, and I will try and go even a bit quicker, is the move to argue, well, I've now argued how matter and energy becomes meaning for a living organism. But now the interesting point for us as humanities scholars, I think, is how does this meaning, or the significance, once it's been established, how is that able to constrain matter and energy, right? Because we do things in the world, we change the material conditions around us. How is that possible? So we go back to information. That's a difference that makes a difference. The first difference is the matter and energy. And the second difference is what Deacon calls an absential difference, the ideas that we form. And like I said, like energy, which is the relationship of difference between material systems, information is also a relation of difference for an observer. And the significance is the relevance of these differences, right? So I've made that argument. What I now have to argue, and what is, I think, needed for this argument, is to argue that this significance itself can become objectified or materialized, if you want to call it that. And I think here we need to start at the beginning of life with the membrane as the cut or the border between organisms and the environment. And that cut is sort of necessary for all subsequent developments of meaning making. There's an inside to an organism which has interests, and it stands in relationship to an outside which can kill it, which can make it suffer, which can make it thrive. And all interactions between the organism and its environment needs to consider consider the environment for the survival of the organism. So I think our process begins with membranes. But in multicellular organisms, you don't only have this one-sided communication between the organism and its environment. In a multicellular organism, you also have to need internal communication between cells and organs, chemical, electrical, etc., etc. And then we have the set of communication with the environment, which is our sense organs. So this led, and I'm here trying to give an explanation of how, from very simple semiosis in simple bacteria to where we are today in terms of human beings, how this emerged. So out of all of this emerged a nervous system, a central nervous system, a brain, and a brain body that can perform language. So the meaning making evolved from a very simple stimulus response kind of meaning making to a very complex metacognition. And I think the core of the argument about how significance becomes objectified lies in this diagram, which I took from Sharov Tønneson's book on semiotic agency. So this makes clear that any living organism, and here it's the human being, is a kind of a three-tiered existence, with a body with multiple levels of existence, from molecular agents up to organs, but then also with cognitive abilities. And if you look in at the middle level of cognition, you will see that our cognitive, the bodily cognitive features have, on the one hand, perceptual subagents, in other words, eyes, ears, noses, skins that can feel where information comes in. And on the other side, it has effector agents. So these things are linked into one another. They're not separate. They are entangled into one another. So you also have hands that can do things, legs that can run, mouths that can eat, etc., etc. And all of these are linked together by what they call the integrating sub-agents, which is the brain, the nervous system, which integrates all of these physical material information into significance, linked to the memory, obviously, because you do all your perception against the background of a memory. So the point here is that our cognitive functions are embedded and entangled in the matter energy of our bodies. And they play a kind of, those sub-agents play a kind of a double role. They are material, but they give rise to non-material ideas. And I will show now how the non-material ideas then constrain them. Then you obviously also have the niche, the environment, and I will talk a bit more about the environment in a moment. So I think the key to how significance can become a constraint in itself, how it can constrain matter, is with language. With language, cognition can become objectified. In other words, my thoughts can be put into sounds, or they can have words attached to them, and they become things about which I can think again. So it becomes a higher level of reflection, which means that the lower level can become objectified. With writing, with audio recordings, etc., language is objectified. So with language, cognition is objectified, and then with all the technical tools we have, technological tools, language can also be objectified. And in addition to that, the extended mind hypothesis, or the distributed mind hypothesis, suggests that cognition is distributed throughout the whole body, between bodies and into the environment, which means actually that much of our thinking and ways of thinking lies in the materialities around us. Let's say in the calculators, or in the computers we use, or in the fingers we use to count on. So they are already externally objectified, if I can call it that. So we sort of have, I think, networks now of objectified cognition. Artifacts, practices, social structure. In literature, we have canons of objectified cognition, which can then again become the constraints for further thought and for further action. So ideas, significances, social structures, metacognitions now constrain brains to think, and brains constrain nervous systems, which constrains muscles to operate in certain ways. But the overall constraint here was the intention that started out with ideas. So I think with this, if we make the argument that with language, thought itself becomes objectified, and with thought that is embedded, as I said, in our whole bodily system, we have enough of an argument, I think, to argue that ideas are able then to constrain the material conditions around us. And in this way, as John Dewey says, the essential, the material energy, and the absential, the ideational, are woven into one cloth. An example would be something like safety. I don't feel safe when it becomes dark, so I go back to the same cave every night, and I put some large rocks in the front of the cave so that I try and protect myself. Later on, it's too much effort to do that, so I use branches to build myself a cave. And later I see that, well, these branches decay, so let me rather use rocks to build myself a cave, which then became houses and flats and everything that we know today. So I think with this we can explain that translation is this process in which matter and mind are entangled, in which semiotic agents do semiotic work to constrain semiotic material, which is ideas, existing meanings, existing artifacts, social structures, to constrain them in order to share or to recreate or to modify or to manipulate significances in different forms and in different shapes. So this means that material things are being changed under the guidance of significance. Okay, I'm going to skip this, and I'm also going to skip this because I want to get to the data that I have. Just as a conclusion, I think Michael Cronin has written about a troposphere, and I think the kind of ideas that I've suggested here complements those, where you have energy and matter that develops or evolves into life. Out of that emerges significance and objectified significance, about which I spoke, and that objectified significance that again constrains the matter. And this process can also run this way. So you have a nice troposphere in which matter, energy, life, significance are entangled in one kind of explanation. Right. So I have a few minutes left. I wanted to share some empirical analysis that I did just to show you what one can do with this. Obviously, this isn't a method for analyzing literary translations. Well, not a method. It might inform some analysis, but I'm not suggesting really a method here. I'm basically using some form of conversational analysis in this example that I will show you. So I got this data from a training session, or from a training intervention, which is called the mediational intervention for sensitizing caregivers. And it was an intervention that was run in our city in 2018, in which care workers, home care workers, in other words, lay teachers, were taught skills to care for children, and specifically for vulnerable children. I'm talking AIDS orphans, I'm talking child-led households, I'm talking abused children. So they were all under the category vulnerable children. And the idea was that these care workers, if they have a bit more training, can help emotionally and intellectually to develop these children. So I had I received 150 videos. Let me also just say, I wasn't part of the original project. I got this later on, so this is what we would call secondary data. I didn't collect the data. There were 150 videos made of 5 minutes each. 50 were made before the training started. 50 were made after 6 months of training, and 50 were made after a year of training. I used all 50 from the baseline, 25 after 6 months, and 25 from after a year. So I looked at 100 videos, watched them, made notes, and analyzed them. The interactions were in Sesotho, which is the dominant local language in our area, which I don't speak, but I have a basic knowledge of it. But that didn't bother me because I wasn't interested in the language per se. And I will show you sort of how this works. So I did the analysis, watched all the videos, and then started like with the coding process, looking at what is the general features of these interactions between the care workers and the children. The children were always between about 7 and 12 years old. So it was primary school in our context children. So I was looking at what I would call the dominant trajectory that emerged out of these interactions that I can describe. And then I looked at 1 or 2 outliers which just confounded the findings, and I will explain to you why I thought that was interesting. So what I had in front of me, I represent it in a bit of a diagram. So on the top, the two black lines were the chairs. The two red lines were the shoulder positions of the two participants. On the left, you would have your left. You would have the child with on the right-hand side, you would have the care worker. The arrows would be their head positions. The little dotted lines, their arms. The purple rectangle would be a page with a drawing that the children had to color, and the green triangle would be the box with crayons that they could use, right? So I basically, for each video, drew sort of this kind of diagram to see how the bodies interacted and to be able to describe that. Sometimes the chairs were moved, sometimes the shoulders were moved, sometimes the head, sometimes the arms, and everything. So everything could be moved, and those could have meanings in the system. So here are my sort of here's the general trajectory that I found. So in all cases, the teacher starts the interview, never the child. In only about 5 of the 100 cases that I watched did a child initiate interaction after the beginning of the video. So never at the beginning of the video. The teacher always started. Children never interacted. They just sat there and they kept quiet, and they would only respond to what the teacher said. There were these 5 cases, as I said, toward where towards the end of the video, children became comfortable enough to initiate interaction. In most cases, the teacher controlled the space on the table, so they would put the paper with the drawing in front of the child. They would move the crayons, say where it is, so they controlled that space. In most of the cases, again, 95 to 98% of the cases, children only responded in monosyllabic verbal responses, like a yes or a no, or if the teacher asked them, what is this? They would say an apple, or what color is it? They would say green. So very seldom did they use sentences. It was mostly these monosyllabic responses, and sometimes just even grunts like or but monosyllabic, very few full sentences. In most cases, the teacher only instructs and asks. In other words, do this, or what is this, what is this? So the teacher constrains the interaction through the pragmatics of the language use. In other words, instructions and questions, which makes it difficult for the children to talk about anything else. They never ask the children, tell me about your day at school, for instance. So there's very little cognitive interaction between the caregiver and the child. Remember, these are vulnerable children, traumatized children, and even less emotional interaction. Sometimes not a smile at the end, sometimes not a hug, nothing. So here comes the question. If I observe this very strong trajectory, the question now becomes why? Are we looking at an authoritarian culture? And this culture specifically has strong views about respecting elders. Are we looking at the at-risk children, which all of these were vulnerable children? Are we looking at the teachers' lack of competence? Some of these teachers weren't even able to engage with the kids. So what is the reason for this? And the interesting thing that I am trying to argue here is, for me at least, is that well, firstly, there's no one reason why, but also I'm not sure that there are reasons why, in the sense of that there are causality, that there's causality, right? This thing caused that. It's this culture which caused the child to act in this way. I'm not sure that there's that direct, strong causal line. What I rather suggest is a term, propensity, which I picked up from a British sociologist. I will get to his name in a moment, but I can't remember now. But so he says that in cultural social interactions, you don't really have causes. You have things that happen that make it more likely for other things to happen, which he then calls a propensity. So the authoritarian culture could be creating a propensity for children to act in a certain way. Their at-riskness could create that propensity. So I'm trying to suggest a very soft kind of causality here, where it's not really one thing causes the other, but one thing makes the other possible, makes it possible for the other one to happen. And just to show why I think this is important, you would get situations like this, where on the right-hand side, the teacher has her shoulders bent towards the child. She has her head turned towards the child. She's looking at the child. I found cases where she would be talking to the child and trying to engage the child. And the child just kept on veering away. Her chair is moved in the opposite direction, shoulders moved in the opposite direction. She doesn't look at the teacher. She moves the page way away from the teacher. So if the problem was if the propensity was created by the teachers or the care workers not being competent, this competent one should have had a different response, but she didn't. Which means that the kind of propensities at work here are really complex. You sometimes have teachers very good, going out of their way to engage these kids, and the kids are just, either for their culture or for their vulnerability or for another reason, which one could go deeper into, are just not responding positively. You would even get situations like this one, where both are turned to one another. So the chairs are turned to one another, the shoulders, the heads, the arms are open for one another. They're sharing this the piece of paper in the middle. They're both drawing or coloring in, and still there's no verbal interaction between them. They just sit doing this. The children don't respond to questions, or they just again respond in monosyllabic responses. So you can see that the materiality is an indication, but not a clear indication of the ideationality. And the ideationality is an indication, but not a clear indication of the materiality. So my point here being that materiality, ideationality are intertwined, and it's virtually impossible to say which is which and which create the propensities for something to happen. This is my last slide, and what I did here is to say, okay, let us take the dominant, my dominant interpretation of what happened mostly, and put them in a diagram as trajectory one, right? The blue arrows. So you would have the teacher setting the stage by saying, good morning, you're here, we're going to do this. So she's taken charge. She has moved the discussion in a particular direction, in a particular trajectory. She's created a propensity for her being in charge, and the child gets that. Which means that the next step is trajectory 1.1, where the child sort of follows in that line. And where you could then get in the next step, the child is following exactly the same kind of pattern or the same kind of propensity, or you could get some changes, right? That did happen, where at least the child asked a question or whatever. But then all of a sudden, in some cases, you get get trajectory 1.0, where the teacher sets the scene, and then all of a sudden, out of the blue, the child asks a question, which would then be the red arrows that I have there, trajectory 2, which lead to trajectory 2.1, which sometimes actually came back roughly to where the blue ones were, but the whole interaction took a different trajectory. And I think for me, looking at intersemiotic processes like what I've been looking at, material and meaning making, in terms of these kind of trajectories of how what happens in moment A kind of constrains, creates propensities for what happens next in moment B, and what happens next in moment C, is an interesting way to look at these. And then also to look at where do these trajectories change and why do they change? So with that, I am at my 45 minutes, and I'm gonna stop there. Thank you for your time and for listening. And I went through quite a lot of things, so if there are questions, I'm more than happy. I told Duncan that I have nowhere to be in the next hour or two, so I'm here. Thank you very much.
Kobus, thank you so much. That was such a rich presentation, and it set me thinking in so many directions. I'm sure the same applies to our audience as well. So can I invite our audience at this stage to please put your questions to Kobus. Please put them in the Q&A, and I will I'll put them to Kobus, and we've got plenty of time for a discussion now. I wonder, Kobus, if I could kind of pick you up on a almost an aside that you mentioned just as you were coming on to your final example there, practical example, and you said, well, I'm not sure this is a method for analyzing literary translations, and I don't know, I was thinking of plenty of ways in which the approach that you've been outlining today could be of relevance to the practical side of literary translation. Perhaps we can come on to that, because I was also thinking of ways in which your approach really dovetails with other approaches within translation studies. And I wonder if I could invite you to say perhaps a bit more about how your approach relates to, for example, I'm thinking of your focus on energy, how that relates to the focus on power in other translation theorists' works. I'm thinking power has been such an important concept in, particularly, should we say, in the 1990s, 2000s, but in general, as a way of kind of as an underlying concept for analyses of, well, Spivak on the politics of translation, or I'm thinking more recently the work of Pascal Casanova, who is writing about she writes about the accumulation and distribution of literary capital in the world literary field, and this notion of the distribution of capital. It's an economic model, but it's also it seems to me one could interpret it in your sense as a kind of energetic model as well. And I'm wondering how much effort, well, how much work we would have to do to translate your theoretical concepts into these concepts which have already played a significant role in translation theory. It doesn't seem to me as though there's much of a, there's much of a leap there. And I think it's quite exciting to think of ways in which one can read other translation theories precisely through your lens.
Thanks, Duncan. That is a really sort of, for me, a kind of a difficult question, but a very pertinent one. Maybe just firstly, what I am going to do is I'm going to return the favor and invite you. We have a complexity discussion group, which meets once a month online. So in next year, I'm going to invite you to maybe talk to us about what you think is worthwhile in this. in literary translation, because we also have Bible translators, we have all kinds of translators in this group. So maybe I think the first point is we need to talk about this, and I will invite you to do so. So yes, I think obviously there are links with many scholars. So there's on the one hand Douglas Robinson, who works with his somatic affect theory, ideas about literary translation. There's new materialism that works not necessarily with literary translation, but with feminism and how bodies engage. And so I would say that I think there's quite a direct link, but I'm not sure that the link has been made between power and energy, right? So for me, there's a direct, because so what I'm continuously coming up against is that when we talk in the humanities, we talk power. When we talk in the natural sciences, we talk energy. How do we combine these two things in a model or in a way of thinking in which we can talk about also the energy that's involved in social capital, and I really don't yet know. So I also draw quite a bit. I didn't do it today, but I draw a bit on Yuri Lotman's work, and he actually used thermodynamics quite a bit to explain cultural change. So for me, okay, let me also say, I understand the problem. I understand how difficult this is. I mean, if it was easy, people would have done it, right? Because there are definitely difficulties in maintaining these the matter energy side, the mind side, without reducing either to the other. And that is, nobody has done that successfully. I mean, you always fall into one of the sides. Yes, so I think I draw. I'm now writing a paper actually for a presentation that I need to do in December, in which I engaged Douglas Robinson on his work. My critical point would be is that in Robinson, for instance, I don't see an engagement with the material other. His interest is the epistemology of my engagement with the other, right? How does the brain construct my views of the other? And I think that's massively important. And I mean, I grant he's a brilliant guy, and he's published so much. So I just have respect for that. But my question is, so what about the materiality of the other? How does the materiality of the color blue influence my perception of the color blue, if I can put it that way? And that's the kind of so to a short answer to your question that we need to talk a lot more is, yes, I think there are strong links. I'm reading a lot about new materialism also now to try and understand how these things work. But it's difficult to have an elegant kind of explanation. And I see even in the new materialist debates, there are some of the materialists accuse the other materialists of still being idealists, right? So it's a never-ending nuanced debate on how do we deal with the materiality. But we need to talk about it a lot more.
Thank you. I mean, you mentioned Doug Robinson, and I'd precisely been thinking about one aspect of Robinson's recent work, just as you were, again, talking latterly about propensity. And I was wondering, it started me thinking about Robinson's recent work on the affordances of the translator, and an article just from last year, and about the relation perhaps between the notion of propensity and the notion of affordance, which again, I've just started thinking about that, but it would seem to me to be fairly closely related. And I had a further thought as you were talking about propensity as well. And you mentioned propensity in the context of a sense of competence. And I was reflecting on the framework for the education and training of literary translators, which the Petra E network has produced, which is based very centrally on notions of competence. And again, that's given me something to think about and perhaps to take to our Petra E colleagues, although I know Roberta Fabri is in the audience today as well. And perhaps we need to think more about the extent to which competences are constrained precisely, to use another of your key words. I had another thought, and I briefly checked your indexes of your two most recent books to see whether you mention whether you're bringing in Hegel at all, because your notion of constraint seems to me to do potentially quite a lot of interesting work that would be comparable with the notion of negativity in Hegel. But that's leading us too far afield, I'm sure. We have a question in from Sue-Ann Harding. Thank you, Sue-Ann, for your question. And the question is, thanks, Kobus. This is a really interesting example of propensity and emergent trajectories. As to why one trajectory changes into another, I've long tried to place my hope in, quote, small and local stories as being a small change that can create a large change. But I'm thinking that maybe it's violence and power and force that makes the changes. So how do we create change if we're not prepared to be forceful and violent? Were there examples in the data, for example, where great positive changes were a result of particular small changes that changed the propensity?
Yes, I think so. I mean, Sue-Ann, as always, you ask really difficult questions. So there were indeed cases where just a touch on the shoulder from the care worker, you could see the body of the child relaxing. I mean, there were also cases where that touch had the opposite effect, probably because the child was abused, right? It had a cringing effect. So there were one or two cases where the teacher, just by turning to the child, ignoring what's on the table in front of them, paying full attention to the child, for instance, and that had the effect that later on in the discussion, the child would speak full sentences, ask questions, even sometimes, and this happened, I think, really only twice in the 100 videos that I watched, correct the teacher. Say the teacher would color the apple or the grapes green, and the child says, no, grapes are purple, right? Which is sort of in some contexts regarded as a bit cheeky, not in all, but in some. So and yes, I really don't know. One of the lacks in my own thinking is that I am not thinking about how to change. I'm thinking about what are the conditions for change to take place, and how can we understand it? I think we need more talk, and I say this as a gap in my own research, and I think people like you who ask these questions are driving in the right direction. What does this mean for how to change things? And there I'm usually quiet because I don't know how to change life. I don't know. I'm a kind of a pessimist deep down, and I think it is what it is, and I try to describe it and I try to explain it, but how to change it, I don't know. Maybe, Sue-Ann, you can come up with better ideas than I have. I do see, to answer your question, I do see small changes having great effects, but for me, the principle of complexity says that you can never predict the effect of a propensity. Propensities can start small and become very huge. That's the initial conditions argument in complexity thinking. So I don't know. I'm pretty useless when it comes to thinking about how to change the world. Just a quick response also, Duncan, to your observations about Hegel. So I'm pretty much of a ignoramus when it comes to deep philosophy. But Terence Deacon has written a lot about the absential and the negative, and I see the links. I probably need another 50 years to have time to read all these things. So I see the links. I just haven't. It's not that I don't think there are links. It's just I don't have time to read everything. Yeah.
Thanks, Kobus. Suan has added, that's actually very helpful, because you said yes, there are. I keep coming back to the definition that you included early on in your presentation. Translation is negentropic semiotic work that is performed to constrain dynamic semiotic systems for teleodynamic reasons. There's such a lot to unpack in that definition. I think it's really inspiring in many ways. I wonder if we could come back to the notion of constraint, because again, that's a concept which actually we do quite a lot with in our practical sort of translator training, thinking about translating translation and constraint, and translating within conditions of constraint, looking at examples from the history of translation, things like what the Oulipo writers were doing, and the translators then of that kind of experimental writing. I think that concept is particularly focused on in your earlier book, isn't it? In your book on the biosemiotics of translation. And I think I find that a useful kind of bridge concept to take us from high theory, if you like, to the practical situation of a translator who is faced potentially then with a very experimental text, and needing then to work within some perhaps quite significant constraints.
Yes, so I'm just in the process of finishing a book, reading a book, not writing, reading a book about constraints. I've shared it with a complexity group. I can share it with you, and you can share it with your group. It's called Context. I think Context Determines Everything. I can't remember the exact. So this is a 250-page philosophy of what are constraints, how do constraints work, and I don't want to sort of bore everybody into all of that. I think that constraints theory, yes, on the one hand, I think it can be very practical. I take that, but it can be more than just practical. I think it can help us to look for let's say possibilities, for the origins of possibilities in places that we don't necessarily look. So if you the opposite way of a constraint-driven thinking would be a kind of atomistic thinking, right? What are the parts, and how do the parts become wholes? And then I try and understand from the words. I try to understand how I should translate the sentence and the text and the oeuvre or the genre or whatever. Well, if you start with constraints, and actually that's what I think Christiane Noor does, is to start in functionalist theory, is to start with constraints. But you don't only have to start with the constraints on the process. You can look at the constraints in the source text, the constraints in the translator. And then you sort of look at possible things or tendencies or propensities that could swing an influence, if I can put it that way, that makes it more possible for thing A to happen than thing B. And if I think much of our translation studies thinking is still sort of built on the atomistic model, where we start with words and build up. While if we start with what is the whole here, the whole of the source text, and how does that constrain my translation of, let's say, of the sentence, then you have other kind of things that you are thinking about, which I don't think we always pick up. I mean, perhaps in literary translation you do. I know virtually nothing about it, so I don't want to accuse your field of things, but I just think in terms of for me, looking at the things outside of the system, as it were, that have an influence on the system that I'm studying or that I'm translating or dealing with, it opens up possibilities of thinking which I think are new. I think, but yes, very, and I mean, you can hear, you can look at things like money, how money constrains translation. I mean, that's a how energy, what do people who battle with low levels of energy, do they translate differently? Do you translate differently in the morning than in the afternoon? Are there constraints, for instance, in your energy levels to make it very or after you've eaten this you can't translate, or if you're thinking of this you can't translate. It could be very very practical to think about these constraints as steering, making possible certain things. And again, I would like to, I think, advocate for a kind of really soft causality when we deal with these things, because they are so enmeshed, and causes are effects and effects are causes and so on. Yeah, I'll keep quiet now.
Thank you. Yes, your example and the way your method in analyzing the situations in your example reminded me also of another sort of strand of very practical translator analysis, and that's eye tracking. And there is a strand in translator analysis, precisely looking into the kind of the ergonomics of translation, the ways in which translators react to texts in a very physical way. And again, I was thinking of potential parallels with your approach there. That's not an approach I myself have explored, but the notion of ergonomics coming from your last point about how we translate in the morning and in the and in the evening and so on, that's potentially, I think, a fruitful line of inquiry.
It seems to me, Duncan, that it's probably one of these things that are the sort of the zeitgeist, is that we are, from various perspectives. I mean, you spoke about Robinson's affordances, you spoke about now the eye tracking and so on. We are sort of in the lines of thoughts that I'm trying to follow and that I find interesting. We're not looking to explain things, but we're looking to explain the relationship between things. It's sort of like we've exhausted describing a thing, and that we, for some reason, maybe because of the influence of theories of energy, maybe because of computational abilities, I don't know exactly, but we're looking at how things relate, how things fit together, how wholes have impacts on parts and parts on wholes, but the sort of not so much things, but functions and relations. So it seems like a general kind of a zeitgeist that we are all sharing in, and I see that in many other scholars too. Yeah.
I wonder if we could come on next to a very different kind of question, and this is from Raoul Colon in Ottawa. And Raoul asks, well, it says, "Hello, Kobus. Thank you for your seminal presentation on a complex approach to translation. You mentioned recently reading Garnett's, and I read his definition of protyposis, which means an abstract quantum information free of any definite meaning. My question, therefore, is how do you integrate quantum information into your analysis of consciousness that Garnett advances in his work? And more generally, how do you think the quantum paradigm, now in the process of generalization thanks to technology, can or should challenge the classical one at the epistemological level?" And there's a reference there to the article that Raoul is referring to, Quantum Theory and the Nature of Consciousness from 2018.
So first, to be honest, I haven't finished reading Garnett, so I haven't. I'm still in the process of thinking. And Raoul and I have been debating this kind of thing for a while now. So it is also about a question of what do we do with insights from physics and biology when we do the humanities? What are the relevances of these findings? Are there relevances of these findings for humanities? So on the one hand, my argument about quantum theory is that quantum theory explains things at the quantum level, which builds an explanation of things at the phenomenal level, right? In the humanities, we're not interested in the quantum level. We're interested in the phenomenal level. So on the one hand, you can have a very strong argument and say, well, quantum theory has nothing to say for the humanities. However, I think it's a bit more complex. And what I'm at this point, Raoul, what I'm starting to think is that the quantum the whole idea around quantum explanations is to say we start with pure possibility, and out of these possibilities, and that's why Garnett talks about protyposis. There's no meaning in this; it's just possibility, and this possibility then evolves into fixed. At the phenomenal level, into kind of fixed things, and at this quantum level, things are not determinate, and they are both, for instance, wave. If you talk about light, they wave and particle, and I'm starting to wonder whether all of reality don't share that kind of makeup, that whenever you think about anything, you can start imagining it just as a possibility, where, for instance, in the presentation that I made today, you start to think about reality as a possibility where matter and mind are entwined or entangled in terms of quantum theory also, but not. The moment you focus on mind, you forget about you can't focus on matter. The moment you focus on matter, you can't focus on mind. So it's this kind of reality as a set of possibilities that are multiple at the same time. So an atom of ink is at the same time merely matter and meaning. And for me, so to answer your question in short, Raoul, I'm still thinking about this, and we will need to talk about this a lot more. I still don't understand it fully, but I'm starting to get a sense that maybe this entangled binaries, if you want to call it that, I'm not sure, are constitutive of all of our reality. I don't know. So thanks for the question. I don't have a nice answer now.
A question in from Mayra Mendez Galvan. In any translation, the elements at play are more than a source and a target, first of all. The vector between those two is bidirectional, not unidirectional. And as I understand it, there are many more vectors between contextual aspects pertaining or not to the languages and cultures involved. It makes sense to think of things outside of the system that end up involved in this practice, and in literary translation, that is perhaps even more the case. For instance, when translating a poem, there are echoes of other pieces of art that the original remind me of, as it were, that end up influencing the final translated text. Some of those elements are embodied sensations that map one thing onto another. So it seems to be very possible to incorporate this exploration into literary translation. And personally, I have many more ideas about how to do that, particularly applied to translation between texts that are very distant in time. And then Mayra concludes, sorry, not a question. Hate to be that person, but there it is. Thank you. So again, taking your approach and inspired to think about literary translation.
Yes, thanks, Maria. I need people like you also to say that the kind of nonsense that I think up isn't just nonsense. It might have some value. So I appreciate that. And maybe, I mean, you're welcome to share some ideas. I would actually love to hear your ideas. And yes, I mean, we just yesterday in a class that I had, we had somebody engage us on a theory of montage, and we had to start, when you do analysis of montage, you have to start with the very materialities of how this thing is put together, and only later you come to the symbolic meanings and so on. So I suppose that there's that kind of thing in all language. And obviously then in literature and in literary translations, that one could then actually also translate. And the question then is, so if there is this embodied sensation, how do you translate it? Because a sensation in this body is not the same as a sensation in that body. And here again, I think if you start looking at the constraints, for instance, let's just quickly take a poem. If you look at a poem not in terms of I have to have the exact opposite of the exact copy of the poem, but what are the constraints working on this poem, the source text poem, for instance? How do I interpret them? There's always the interpretation part, but then what constraints are available in the or how can I materialize the same constraints in a different context? I'm not even yet sure how to formulate these questions, but thanks. I think you're taking the debate forward, and you're welcome to contact me, and we can talk about this further.
We are coming towards the end of our time today. Just let me throw in one other reference just on the back of your response to Mayra's question there. When you talked about translating embodied sensation, that set me thinking very much of the work of my colleague here at the University of East Anglia, Clive Scott, whose recent book on the philosophy of literary translation has just come out from Cambridge, and his focus is precisely on translating the phenomenology of the reading process, and I think, as you put it, translating embodied sensation is really very central to Clive's thinking about the translation process. I have perhaps a final question for you, Kobus. thinking about how in your presentation today and in your recent book on the thermodynamics of semiosis, you in the book you quite early on are asking who your ideal readership is, and you're suggesting, oh, well, perhaps not natural scientists. And I'm wondering, because your work is so much at the interface between the humanities and the sciences, and I think it's so fruitful in inviting us within translation studies to integrate these concepts and these very these very fundamental ways of thinking about translation's place in the world. Do you? I mean, are you not in some way reaching out to the natural scientists though as well? I'm wondering if it's, I mean, it's not just a one-way process, is it? It's not, as you say, it's not physics envy. I'm wondering whether you've been able to have fruitful conversations with colleagues in the natural sciences who are using translation in the notion of translation in so many different ways, and whether your analyses chime with them.
Yeah, so sort of a quick answer to that would be that I've just last year published with Bloomsbury an edited volume called Translation Beyond Translation Studies, in which I asked mathematicians, biologists, computer scientists, organizational specialists to talk about what they think translation is. So that's part of it. I must say, I have a lot of debate with the biosemiotics people, right? Which some of them are humanities people doing biology, but some of them are also theoretical biologists working in the humanities side. So I do talk to them. I find it difficult to talk to physicists. Stuart Kaufman is one of the physicists that I love to read, because he is able to make the link between physics and kind of the humanities in a way that I've never seen anybody else. I've written an email to our biology department asking them, if we could engage on this and if I could maybe sit into their classes, and then they said they're not interested. This is stuff that's done in the humanities. So it was just I have a doctor friend here on campus. He's a pediatrician. We talk about sort of complexity and meaning making in medicine quite a bit, but we haven't published anything together. Yeah, so it is a difficult journey. I think we have been culturized into. I mean, it's even difficult within humanity sometimes to get people to talk to one another. So across this, so I can't claim that I've been successful in this very, very much. But your question will drive me. I will try again.
Kobus, we have now we've reached the end of our time. So we're going to need to wrap up for today. Can I just say to our audience that the next in our series of research BCLT research seminars will be in 3 weeks' time, and we'll have, in fact, a book launch focusing on the new book by Helen Gibson with the title Translation and Stylistic Variation, Dialect and Heteroglossia in Northern Irish Poetic Translation. So that will be in 3 weeks' time, and details about all of the BCLT research seminars are available on the BCLT website when they become available, and the booking for that will open quite shortly. For the moment, though, Kobus, it's been such a feast. It's been a really inspiring presentation. Thank you for your generous responses to our questions as well. Thank you to our audience. The chat is already filling up with plenty of thanks to you, Kobus, but thank you to our audience and for your questions too. And thank you once again, Kobus, for a really fascinating and inspiring talk, and thank you.
Thanks for having me. It was great.